South Korea is not just a trend. It is a place that feels engineered, like the future is already here. Most Americans think of it as a glossy screen. You picture catchy K-pop, viral dramas, and the smartphone in your pocket. But that version is a carefully curated illusion. The real South Korea is something else entirely. It is a society pushed to the absolute brink. To understand the price of this modern miracle, we must look deeper. This is South Korea, the unseen. Meet Michael. He is 28 years old. He lives in San Francisco. He works in Silicon Valley. It is the epicenter of the modern future. Michael does everything right. He works 60 hours every week. He codes, he builds, he grinds. But the reality of his life does not match the postcard. He shares a cramped apartment. The rent consumes half his income. Owning a house is a complete fantasy. Starting a family is a financial risk he cannot afford. He is physically exhausted. He is running on a high-speed treadmill that only speeds up. This is a familiar American story. You probably know someone exactly like Michael. You might even be Michael. It is the defining modern struggle. It is the quiet panic of the middle class. We see this pressure everywhere. We accept it as normal. We call it the necessary cost of ambition. We think it cannot get any harder, but we are entirely wrong. The American system is built on a specific historical promise. You work hard, you break boundaries, you eventually win. Even when the economic system feels broken, the persistent illusion of the open frontier always remains. Michael can easily quit his job. Michael can pack up and move to Texas. Michael can start a risky garage company. The physical landscape is vast. The personal choices feel wonderfully infinite. There is always a different path to take. There is always another city waiting. But what happens when you erase that beautiful frontier? What happens when the map suddenly shrinks? Imagine taking Michael's heavy burden. Imagine completely removing his geographic escape routes. Imagine placing him in a dense society where the game is rigged before he even learns to walk. A place where hard work is not a guarantee of wealth. It is merely the bare minimum requirement for survival. A place where the pressure does not just shape your career. It aggressively dictates your entire existence. This realization brings us across the Pacific Ocean. We leave the rolling white fog of California far behind. We enter a towering neon metropolis of shining glass and cold steel. We enter a geographic landscape of extreme human density. Imagine Michael trying to live his life here. His grueling 60 hours a week would be considered a light schedule. His cramped shared apartment would be viewed as an absolute luxury. His deep anxiety about starting a family would not be a lonely personal struggle. It would be a recognized national crisis. Because in this unforgiving reality, raw ambition is never enough. Exceptional talent is never enough. You are not just competing against your talented peers. You are competing against an ancient system carefully designed to filter you out. A rigid system controlled by invisible hands. Hands that own the modern hospitals. Hands that own the prestigious schools. Hands that own the towering apartment buildings. This is the unseen reality. In Michael's sprawling America, corporate wealth is scattered across thousands of different competing companies. In this isolated world, almost everything is tightly controlled by just 4 massive family empires. They are not just powerful corporations. They are the very atmosphere you breathe. You are born in their pristine medical centers. You study intensely on their smart devices. You live your life in the branded concrete towers. You buy your daily groceries from their expansive markets. You absolutely cannot escape their immense gravitational pull. They hold nearly half the total wealth of the entire nation, yet they selectively open their heavy doors to only a microscopic fraction of the desperate workforce. To merely survive, you must violently fight for a spot inside their walls. If you fail, you fall deep into the permanent shadows. There is no garage startup culture to magically save you. There is no moving to a cheaper state. You are trapped in a beautiful golden cage. The invisible walls are rapidly closing in. This is not a dark dystopian novel. This is daily modern life. It is the fundamental architecture of an entire society. The psychological toll is absolute. It thoroughly crushes the human spirit before the physical body even realizes it is tired. The youth living here are the most highly educated on earth. They are exceptionally brilliant. They are entirely relentless. Yet they openly refer to their own homeland as a living hell. They surrender their bright youth to endless studying. They surrender their hopeful futures to sterile corporate halls. They look at the American hustle and see a relaxing vacation. The intense stress that breaks a worker in Silicon Valley is just the basic starting line here. The American mirror reflects a truly harsh truth. We loudly complain about the exhausting race. They are fighting fiercely for the right to even step on the track. The striking beauty of the glass towers hides a brutal mechanism. It is a relentless machine that ultimately consumes its own creators. If America is breathless, South Korea is suffocating. Look at the towering skyline of Seoul. It looks like a fortress of modern human achievement. Millions rush through its glowing underground arteries every single day. The streets vibrate with endless kinetic energy. The cafes are packed with highly educated youth. It feels like a society operating at absolute peak performance. But this overwhelming visual noise is deeply deceiving. It is a brilliant mask covering a quiet catastrophe. We usually imagine national collapse as a sudden violent event. We expect loud sirens and immediate visible destruction. But the end of a nation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in absolute silence. It arrives not with a sudden explosion but with an invisible biological retreat. But the suffocating pressure of the present hides a vanishing future. This is the first unseen layer of the South Korean reality. It is a slow-motion demographic extinction. Numbers can often feel detached from daily human reality, but here they represent an absolute timeline of national survival. In the United States, we worry about a slowing demographic engine. The American birth rate hovers around 1.6 children per woman. It forces difficult conversations about future economic growth. But it remains a relatively manageable statistical problem. Now look across the Pacific. In 2023, South Korea recorded a staggering birth rate of 0.72. This is not just a temporary demographic dip. This is an unprecedented biological anomaly. It is the lowest recorded birth rate in human history. A society needs a rate of 2.1 just to maintain its current size. South Korea is completely missing that critical survival threshold. Official demographic data from the National Statistics Agency paints a terrifying picture. A 2024 academic proceeding confirms this undeniable mathematical trajectory. If this trend simply continues unchecked, the math becomes exceptionally ruthless. By the year 2070, the population will aggressively plummet. It will collapse from over 50 million today down to roughly 37 million. Think about what that massive reduction actually means on the ground. It is not just numbers shifting on a government spreadsheet. It is the literal physical shrinking of a modern civilization. It is frozen time creeping slowly across the mountainous landscape. You lose over 10 million human lives in a single lifetime, and you lose them entirely through the conscious choice not to reproduce. This is a deliberate biological strike by an entire generation. They are calculating the immense required cost of basic human survival, and they are rationally deciding to stop the bloodline. The natural reproductive instinct has been completely overridden by environmental hostility. This is a profound evolutionary failure caused entirely by modern societal architecture. When the environment becomes too harsh, nature simply stops creating new life. It is practical, it is survival, it is the ultimate quiet rebellion against an impossible economic system. This rapid vanishing does not happen evenly across the entire peninsula. It starts at the rural edges and slowly eats inward. The coastal villages and southern provinces are the very first to freeze. Young people desperately flee these dying towns for the crushing density of Seoul, seeking rare economic survival. They leave behind entire regions trapped in a permanent demographic winter. Hundreds of rural elementary schools have already closed their heavy doors forever. Their empty classrooms stand as quiet monuments to a disappearing youth. Local governments offer desperate cash incentives to anyone willing to give birth, but money cannot fix a fundamental structural rot. You cannot simply buy a child's future in a broken system. The emptiness eventually reaches the glowing capital city itself. Even surrounded by 25 million people, the silence of missing children grows deafening. So the question is not simply why the birth rate is falling. The real question is what kind of society makes its own citizens refuse to create life. What invisible forces are powerful enough to break the oldest biological imperative? It requires an overwhelming amount of daily psychological and financial terror. The youth are not selfishly choosing luxury over traditional family building. They are standing at the edge of a deep economic cliff. They are choosing to save their unborn children from the exact same daily misery. They are absorbing the immense pain of biological dead ends to spare the next generation. The falling population is not the actual root disease. It is merely the clearest symptom of a terminal societal sickness. The modern miracle was built on an unsustainable foundation of human sacrifice, and now the heavy bill is finally coming due. A country that stops giving birth is a country that has stopped believing in tomorrow. Walk through the center of Seoul at midnight. The skyline is a dazzling display of kinetic electricity. The infrastructure is an absolute marvel of modern engineering. Bullet trains slice through the mountainous landscape with mathematical precision. High-speed elevators rocket up glass towers in seconds. Autonomous delivery vehicles hum quietly along perfectly paved smart roads. It feels like a brilliant science fiction utopia. It looks like a society preparing to conquer the future. But look closer at the polished street corners. Walk past the glowing digital billboards. Step into the residential neighborhoods hiding just behind the commercial glitz. The gleaming architecture was aggressively built for a booming population. But the intended occupants are simply not there. The physical city is expanding. The human soul of the city is evaporating. This is the terrifying twist of a modern demographic collapse. You do not see crumbling ruins. You see pristine, perfectly maintained emptiness. It is a loud city suffering from a deafening silence. We fundamentally misunderstand how a nation shrinks. We assume a smaller population just means less traffic and more open space. We think of it as a comfortable downsizing. But modern infrastructure is entirely built on the strict assumption of continuous human growth. The massive power grids, the sprawling subway networks, the national pension funds, they all require a constantly expanding base of young, active contributors to financially survive. When the birth rate collapses, this complex mathematical equation instantly breaks. The ripple effect is violent and systemic. The tax base rapidly hollows out. The cost of maintaining the futuristic infrastructure becomes an impossible burden. The state must frantically stretch a shrinking budget across a rapidly aging society. It is an economic death spiral happening in plain sight. But the fading infrastructure is only half the story. To truly understand the unseen South Korea, you have to leave the business districts. You have to look at the physical spaces where the future was supposed to begin. Drive into the quiet suburbs and look for buildings painted in cheerful pastel yellows and soft blues. These were once vibrant kindergartens. Just a decade ago, these halls echoed with the chaotic, joyful noise of toddlers. The walls were covered in bright crayon drawings. The bathrooms had tiny sinks built perfectly for small hands. The playgrounds outside were packed with children learning how to run. Today, the pastel paint is peeling. The tiny colorful chairs have been permanently removed. The brightly colored jungle gyms outside have been quietly dismantled and sold for scrap metal. These buildings have not been abandoned. They have been entirely repurposed for a new, grim reality. The rooms that once nurtured the beginning of life are now heavily modified to manage its quiet end. The kindergarten has become a senior nursing home. The child-sized furniture is replaced by sterile medical beds and heavy oxygen machines. Sturdy metal handrails are bolted along the hallways where toddlers once learned to walk. The faint smell of sweet Play-Doh is replaced by the sharp clinical scent of medical antiseptic. An elderly woman sits quietly in a wheelchair, staring out the exact same window where a child used to eagerly watch for their parents. The demographic collapse is no longer just a statistic on a government chart. It is physical. It is architectural. The spaces of hope have been forcibly transformed into waiting rooms for their end. This creates an invisible, crushing weight on the few young people who are left. The demographic pyramid has completely inverted. A microscopic foundation of exhausted youth is now being forced to physically and financially carry an exploding mountain of the elderly. There is no historical precedent for this specific type of societal burden. In the past, large families shared the heavy duty of caring for aging parents. Today, a single overworked child might bear the sole responsibility for multiple aging relatives. The immense financial gravity of this obligation pulls them even further away from the idea of starting their own families. It creates a perfect, inescapable feedback loop of demographic destruction. The government desperately attempts to plug this massive human void with bleeding-edge technology. You see robotic baristas pouring coffee in spotless cafes. You see automated kiosks replacing human cashiers in every single convenience store. You see artificial intelligence slowly being tested for elderly care. Outsiders look at these advanced machines and marvel at the rapid technological progress. They see a country living in the year 2050, but this hyper-automation is not necessarily driven by a pure desire to innovate. It is driven by absolute necessity. They are frantically building machines because there are simply no humans left to do the work. The futuristic shin is actually a desperate high-tech bandage over a fatal demographic wound. It is practical. It is survival. Underneath the futuristic skyline, an oligarchy thrives. The rapid economic rise of South Korea is often celebrated as a brilliant triumph of free market capitalism. It is sold globally as the ultimate proof that relentless hard work always brings national prosperity. But this carefully packaged narrative ignores the brutal mechanics operating beneath the surface. It is not an open market of endless possibilities. It is a highly engineered economic fortress, carefully designed to protect a very specific bloodline. The wealth of the nation is not distributed. It is ruthlessly centralized. This brings us to the second unseen layer of the South Korean reality. It is a modern society operating under a neo-feudal economic structure. The citizens do not serve kings, they serve the chaebol. The chaebol are the massive family-run conglomerates that completely dominate the South Korean landscape. To understand their immense scale, you have to fundamentally change how you measure corporate power. In the United States, we worry about the vast influence of big tech. We debate the growing power of Apple, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. But even combined, those massive American titans only control a fraction of the total United States economy. They exist within a diverse ecosystem of millions of other competing businesses. The American worker still has a realistic choice of where to sell their labor. The American consumer still has a realistic choice of where to spend their money. Now imagine a radically different reality. Imagine if those 4 American tech companies physically owned the hospitals you're born in. Imagine if they built the concrete apartment towers you live in. Imagine if they manufactured the cars you drive and operated the universities you attend. Imagine if their corporate reach was so absolute that it touched every single hour of your human existence. This terrifying hypothetical is the absolute daily reality in South Korea. Just 4 primary family dynasties hold the keys to the entire nation. Samsung, SK, Hyundai, and LG. These names are recognized globally as successful tech and manufacturing brands, but domestically they are the undeniable pillars holding up the entire state. A recent analysis from the University of California, Los Angeles reveals the staggering mathematical truth. In the year 2023, these top 4 chaebols alone generated a combined revenue equal to 40.8% of the entire national GDP. They are not merely operating within the national economy, they effectively are the national economy. The state relies on their continuous success for basic global survival. This creates an incredibly dangerous power dynamic. When a corporation becomes too big to fail, it also becomes too powerful to regulate. But this massive concentration of wealth hides a devastating structural flaw. This is the exact point where the system begins to suffocate its own citizens. These 4 towering conglomerates control nearly half of the money flowing through the country, yet they only provide roughly 10 to 11% of the total available jobs. This creates a terrifying statistical bottleneck. The overwhelming majority of the wealth is locked inside a tiny, exclusive corporate vault. The vast majority of the population is left standing outside the heavy gates. They are forced to aggressively fight over the remaining scraps of the economy. Small and medium businesses struggle to survive in the shadow of these giants. They cannot match the salaries, they cannot offer the same social prestige. They are constantly squeezed by the overwhelming market power of the chaebol. This mathematical reality completely destroys the basic promise of the middle class. If you do not secure one of those incredibly rare positions inside the top 10%, you are permanently economically marginalized. Your hard work no longer guarantees stability, it barely guarantees survival. The path to a comfortable life is not broad and diverse. It is a single, narrow tightrope suspended over an economic abyss. Millions of young people are forced onto the same dangerous path. The competition is not just difficult, it is mathematically designed to ensure that 90% of the participants will ultimately fail. The youth are perfectly aware of this rigged equation. They understand that their intense effort is largely futile. The crushing pressure to squeeze through this impossible corporate bottleneck is the true engine driving the demographic collapse. The invisible wall protecting the chaebol is the very same wall blocking the future of the youth. The system is functioning exactly as it was designed to. We are raised on a very specific cultural mythology in the United States. We call it the American dream. It is the belief that sheer willpower can overcome any obstacle. If you study diligently at a public high school, graduate from a state college, and put in the exhausting hours, the system will eventually reward you. You can buy a house, you can raise a family, you are the master of your destiny. But step into the fluorescent lit study halls of Seoul at 2 in the morning. That comforting American narrative completely disintegrates. Here, working incredibly hard is simply the baseline requirement to breathe. The South Korean reality operates on a terrifyingly different set of rules. Dedication does not guarantee success. Excellence does not guarantee a middle-class life. To secure a future, you must violently claw your way into the absolute top 10% of the national elite. Anything less is considered a catastrophic failure. Meet Min Soo. He is 26 years old. He sits perfectly still in a cramped windowless study cubicle in the Noryangjin district of Seoul. The room is no larger than a small American walk-in closet. The air is thick with the smell of cheap instant coffee and profound anxiety. Min Soo is not a high school dropout struggling to find his path. He is part of a generation where nearly 70% of people his age hold a prestigious university degree. They are the most fiercely educated young adults on the planet. He has spent the last 2 decades doing absolutely everything right. He sacrificed his childhood weekends to attend intense private cram schools. He survived the brutal national college entrance exams that forced the entire country into silence. He graduated with top honors in America. Min Soo would be fighting off corporate recruiters. In Seoul, he is completely invisible. He is just another overqualified applicant, desperately trapped in the prestige economy. This prestige economy is a merciless gladiator arena. Min Soo is not just looking for a job to pay his monthly rent. He is preparing for the ultimate corporate battle. He is studying 18 hours a day to pass the hyper-competitive entrance exams for one of the massive family conglomerates. He knows that landing a job outside the chaebol sphere means resigning himself to a life of financial insignificance, so he studies. He memorizes advanced logic puzzles. He perfects his English pronunciation. He curates an absolutely flawless resume. He even practices his interview posture in a small mirror, ensuring his bow is the exact required angle. He is competing against hundreds of thousands of identical exhausted graduates for a microscopic sliver of opportunity. It is a desperate lottery ticket where the currency is your youth. He watches the seasons change through the tiny frosted window, realizing his 20s are completely evaporating. He is fighting a war of attrition. When you are forced to dedicate every waking second to professional survival, other human desires must be aggressively amputated. Min Soo has officially joined the ranks of what his peers bitterly call the N-Po generation. The letter N represents an infinite mathematical number, and Po means to give up. First, he gave up courtship. He simply cannot afford the time or money to take a woman out for dinner in the expensive districts of Gangnam. Next, he gave up the dream of marriage. The social expectation to provide a home for a new bride is a financial impossibility when you have zero income. Then, he gave up the idea of ever having children. How can he possibly bring a new life into a world that is currently crushing him? He gave up hobbies. He gave up friendships. He entirely gave up the basic expectation of happiness. He is systematically stripping away every single thing that makes life worth living. This is the heavy, suffocating tragedy of the modern South Korean youth. They are not lazy. They are not entitled. They are the most resilient, hardworking generation in their nation's history. But they are running a race with no finish line. Min Soo packs up his heavy textbooks as the sun begins to rise over the concrete skyline. He walks out onto the freezing winter street alongside thousands of other perfectly silent, deeply exhausted students. They look like an army of ghosts wandering through a futuristic metropolis. They have traded their entire human existence for a tiny, improbable chance at economic stability. The traditional American dream promises that you can slowly build a life if you just try hard enough. The South Korean reality demands that you completely destroy your life before you are even allowed to begin. You watch the exhausted youth sacrificing their entire existence in tiny study rooms, and you naturally assume a logical endgame. You assume that once they finally pass the impossible exam and enter the glittering corporate headquarters, the suffering permanently stops. You think the heavy prize for surviving the youth is a comfortable, secure adulthood. But getting the prized job is only half the story, because South Korea is also a country of relentless corporate endurance. Entering the glass tower is not the finish line. It is simply the starting gun for a much more brutal marathon. This is the third unseen layer, the unforgiving grind. If you are still watching, you are already seeing what most never will. You are looking past the neat economic statistics and directly into the human machinery that powers the modern miracle. In the United States, the modern corporate conversation is rapidly shifting toward mental health. American workers actively demand a sustainable work-life balance. They negotiate for flexible remote work days. They proudly embrace quiet quitting when they feel undervalued by their massive employers. The American corporate culture is slowly learning to respect the absolute necessity of personal boundaries. Now, entirely erase that concept from your mind. In this specific ecosystem, the word boundary is practically a fireable offense. You do not negotiate with the system. The system owns your absolute loyalty. It owns your waking hours. It effectively owns your biological clock. Let us trace the invisible timeline of a single corporate day to understand this immense pressure. It begins in the freezing dark at 6 in the morning. The massive underground subway stations fill with a completely silent army dressed in identical dark wool coats. Nobody speaks. Nobody makes eye contact. The sheer human density is physically overwhelming, yet the collective silence is completely deafening. They march in perfect unspoken synchronization toward the towering steel monoliths of the financial district. By 8 in the morning, they are sitting completely rigidly at their perfectly organized desks. The strict social hierarchy is immediately established. You do not dare leave your desk before your immediate manager. You do not casually express a dissenting opinion. You exist exclusively as a tiny, replaceable gear in a terrifyingly massive economic engine. The hours drag on with a heavy, suffocating weight. Lunch is consumed rapidly, often inside the sterile company cafeteria, merely to maximize the time spent staring at a glowing monitor. The physical presence in the office is valued far above the actual efficient output of the worker. It is an extreme culture of visual endurance. You must look incredibly busy even when the actual daily task is entirely finished. The raw data behind this daily reality is deeply alarming. According to a 2026 report by the Chosun Ilbo analyzing recent OECD data, the average South Korean employee works an astonishing 1,859 hours every single year. That is a staggering 151 hours higher than the broader international average. It represents weeks of stolen life, extracted directly from the citizens to fuel the national GDP. When the clock finally strikes 7 in the evening, the American worker is usually driving home to cook dinner with their family. Here, the monitor stays on. Leaving exactly at the official end of the shift is considered an aggressive act of corporate betrayal, so they wait. They wait for the senior director to finally stand up and grab his coat. And even when the office lights finally dim at 9 at night, the workday is still not over. The brutal cultural tradition of mandatory after-work drinking officially begins. You must pour drinks for your superiors with both hands. You must loudly laugh at their jokes. You must aggressively consume alcohol until the early hours of the morning to prove your ultimate team loyalty. Declining this invitation is professional suicide. It is only approaching midnight when they finally stumble back onto the last departing train. They stare blankly at their glowing smartphone screens, heavily sedated by pure exhaustion and cheap alcohol. They will sleep for exactly 5 hours before the brutal alarm clock rings in the dark again. Is this the ultimate reward for a lifetime of flawless obedience? You spend 20 years violently destroying your mental health just to win a highly coveted seat at this exact corporate table. And when you finally sit down, you slowly realize the feast is actually a slow execution. You have successfully won the economic lottery. But the grand prize is an inescapable life sentence of pure exhaustion. We have established the terrifying length of the South Korean workday, but length does not automatically dictate value. You look at the sheer volume of human hours poured into the glowing monitors of Seoul, and you naturally assume an unmatched level of global economic output. If a nation collectively sacrifices its sleep, its youth, and its family life for the corporate machine, that machine must logically be the most efficient engine on the entire planet. We are fundamentally taught to believe that input always equals output. We assume that staying at a perfectly organized desk until midnight automatically translates to groundbreaking innovation and immense corporate profitability. We picture an unstoppable army of hyper-focused workers solving complex technical problems at the speed of light. But this is where the glittering modern miracle completely fractures under the heavy weight of its own strict rules. The brutal daily sacrifice is not actually fueling a hyper-efficient modern economy. It is merely feeding a massive theatrical illusion. This brings us to a deeply frustrating twist of logic. The endless human suffering does not even produce the intended economic result. According to a 2026 analysis by the Chosun Ilbo, utilizing recent OECD data, South Korean labor productivity per hour currently ranks a dismal 31st among developed nations. This is the ultimate heartbreaking paradox of the modern grind. They are working longer, harder, and more desperately than almost anyone else in the developed world. Yet, the actual financial value generated during each of those grueling hours is shockingly low. The strict corporate math simply does not add up. The intense corporate loyalty and the terrifyingly long night shifts are ultimately producing a hollow yield. You are watching millions of brilliant minds running themselves into the ground, but the giant economic wheel they are desperately turning is barely moving forward. It is a rigid system perfectly optimized for absolute obedience rather than actual effectiveness. The numbers completely destroy the mythical narrative of the tireless Asian tiger. The exhausting daily race is not being run to win a global gold medal. It is being run simply because nobody is ever allowed to stop running. Why does such an intensely educated and fiercely ambitious workforce produce such highly inefficient hourly results? The true answer lies directly in the deeply ingrained cultural architecture of the corporate workplace itself. This is not a dynamic culture of rapid problem solving. It is a rigid, suffocating culture of performative endurance. When your entire professional survival depends on simply outlasting your senior manager at the office desk, actual focused work becomes entirely secondary. Exhausted employees quickly learn to artificially stretch a simple 2-hour task into an agonizing 10-hour ordeal just to visually prove their unwavering dedication to the wealthy conglomerate. True creativity completely dies in the constant presence of overwhelming physical exhaustion. Genuine innovation cannot possibly breathe in a silent room where questioning a senior executive is considered a severe social violation. The human brain is not a tireless steel factory machine that can be programmed to run endlessly. When the mind is subjected to chronic sleep deprivation and constant psychological terror, it immediately defaults to a basic biological survival mode. It stops boldly inventing and merely starts quietly copying to avoid drawing dangerous attention. The rigid ancient hierarchy demands absolute conformity from its workers, effectively neutralizing the brilliant individual talents of the highest educated youth in the world. They are hopelessly trapped in a performative cage where looking extremely busy is financially rewarded far more than actually being brilliant. This bizarre phenomenon completely redefines our basic understanding of modern work. You start to realize that the endless late-night meetings and the mandatory drinking sessions are not designed to increase corporate revenue. They are carefully designed to break the individual ego and enforce absolute compliance to the family dynasty. The system measures your worth, not by the brilliant ideas you contribute, but by the sheer amount of personal pain you're willing to silently absorb for the company logo. It is a tragic misallocation of human brilliance. Imagine gathering the brightest, most capable young engineers and thinkers on the continent, only to force them to stare blankly at spreadsheets until midnight simply because the boss refuses to go home. It is a profound insult to human potential. The towering glass skyscrapers are not humming with efficient, futuristic productivity. They are filled with silent, anxious people, slowly typing emails to avoid making eye contact with the clock. This is not efficient free market capitalism. It is a theatrical, exhausting performance of physical labor. It is a daily, mandatory ritual of submission, brilliantly disguised as necessary economic productivity. The nation is completely burning out its most valuable, irreplaceable resource for the mere appearance of hard work. This profound systemic waste of an entire generation's potential is a defining feature of the unseen. We have walked through the empty kindergartens. We have looked at the massive wealth locked inside the corporate titans. We have witnessed the punishing endurance required just to survive a single Tuesday, but these are all just the visible symptoms of a much deeper structural rot. When you subject the human mind to this exact combination of intense pressure and absolute hopelessness, something fundamental eventually shatters. The final unseen layer of South Korea is the most tragic consequence of its own rapid success. It is the psychological darkness. This system does not just exhaust people, it breaks them. In most developed nations, the leading causes of death among the young are typically tragic accidents or aggressive illnesses. Those are physical failures, but here, the greatest threat to a young person's life is not physical, it is entirely psychological. A recent medical analysis published in the Journal of Psychosocial Nursing and Mental Health Services, citing clear OECD data, lays out the devastating truth. Suicide is the absolute leading cause of death for South Koreans aged 10 to 39. Read that age range again. It begins at 10 years old. Children who have barely learned to write complex sentences are already buckling under the unbearable weight of national expectation. They look at the impossible road ahead and decide the brutal journey is simply not worth starting. This is not a failure of individual resilience. It is the catastrophic failure of an entire society to protect its most vulnerable minds. The statistics are a stark, undeniable indictment of the modern miracle. In 2022, the suicide rate hit 23.2 per 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, the average rate across the rest of the developed OECD nations is 10.7. South Korea is suffering from a psychological mortality rate more than double the global standard. This is the heavy, silent toll of the prestige economy. This is the actual price of maintaining the glittering glass towers and the flawlessly efficient bullet trains. When success is narrowly defined as achieving the absolute top tier, and failure is culturally viewed as an unforgivable personal disgrace, the pressure becomes literally lethal. The intense cultural stigma surrounding mental health issues only deepens the tragedy. You are expected to endure the immense pain in perfect silence. Asking for psychological help is often seen as a dangerous admission of professional weakness in an environment that only rewards ruthless strength. This darkness is not isolated to the impoverished edges of the country. It strikes the most privileged youth living in the wealthiest districts. It strikes the top executives who have theoretically already won the corporate game. The despair is completely systemic. When an entire culture measures human worth exclusively by test scores and corporate titles, it effectively strips away the inherent value of simply being alive. You are not a person, you are a resume. And if that resume is deemed insufficient by the family conglomerates, you are culturally discarded. The terrifying reality is that this high mortality rate is essentially treated as a normal operating cost of the national economy. It is the grim collateral damage of rapid capitalistic growth. This is the final, undeniable truth of the South Korean model. A country cannot truly be considered a modern success if the very people building it are desperately trying to escape it. You can read the tragic medical reports and understand the immense statistical scale of the crisis, but statistics do not bleed. They do not accurately capture the agonizing daily texture of living inside a pressure cooker. To truly comprehend the profound psychological darkness, you have to look directly into the faces of the people navigating it. You have to observe the subtle, heartbreaking contrast between the flawless public performance and the devastating private reality. Take a slow walk down the glittering main avenue of Gangnam District on a bustling Friday evening. It is a stunning visual masterpiece of modern capitalism. The air is filled with the sweet scent of expensive perfumes and the low hum of luxury European sports cars. The towering digital billboards project loop after loop of impossibly beautiful, perfectly symmetrical faces selling the ultimate promise of happiness. The pedestrians walking beneath these glowing screens are impeccably dressed in the latest high-end fashion. Every single visual element is carefully curated to project absolute undeniable success. It looks like a city entirely populated by vibrant, thriving winners, but this is an incredibly demanding, exhausting performance. This fierce dedication to absolute external perfection is actually a heavy, invisible armor in a society that mercilessly punishes any perceived flaw. Projecting success becomes a literal survival mechanism. You cannot afford to look tired. You cannot afford to look poor. You cannot afford to look anything less than perfectly optimized. But if you stand completely still and watch carefully, the flawless mask occasionally slips. You begin to notice the deep, exhausted shadows, carefully hidden under the expensive designer makeup. You notice the nervous, frantic energy of young professionals constantly checking their work phones in the middle of a supposed celebration. You see groups of friends laughing loudly over expensive drinks, but their eyes remain completely dead and disconnected. They are perfectly executing the complex choreography of a happy life, but the actual joy is completely absent. It is an entire generation trapped in a beautiful, glittering display case, desperately performing for an invisible, judgmental audience. The true weight of this endless performance only reveals itself when the lights finally go down. Leave the loud, vibrant streets of Gangnam and descend into the cold, concrete tunnels of the subway system just before the final train departs. The loud, performative energy completely evaporates. The identical wool coats are heavily draped over slumping, defeated shoulders. The expensive designer bags are dropped carelessly onto the dirty floor. There is no more forced laughter. There is no more desperate networking. There is only a profound collective exhaustion that seems to completely crush the oxygen out of the train car. You look down the long row of plastic seats and you see dozens of young, brilliant minds entirely drained of their life force. Some are aggressively rubbing their temples to fight off stress headaches. Others are staring blankly at the dark window reflections, trying to gather just enough energy to survive the exact same cycle tomorrow. This silent commute is the exact moment when the crushing isolation of the system becomes undeniable. They are surrounded by millions of people experiencing the exact same profound misery, yet they have never felt more completely alone. The ancient human structures that once provided deep emotional support have been systematically dismantled. The large, noisy family dinners have been permanently replaced by solitary, silent meals eaten quickly in front of glowing screens. The supportive local communities have been entirely dissolved into anonymous, towering apartment blocks. The intense, hyper-competitive nature of the educational and corporate systems naturally breeds deep paranoia instead of genuine connection. Your closest peer is also your most dangerous rival for that single rare promotion. You cannot confess your deep anxieties to them. You cannot show weakness to the people who are positioned to actively benefit from your failure. You are forced to carry the massive weight of your own existence entirely by yourself. And you must do it while constantly smiling and pretending it is effortless. It is a terrifying new kind of wilderness. In the past, humanity battled the unforgiving physical extremes of raw nature. They fought freezing winters and unpredictable famines. Today, this generation is fighting an entirely new, deeply psychological environment that is just as ruthless and far more complex. The relentless corporate machine is their unforgiving nature. The endless exams and social expectations are their brutal winters. The ancient struggle for basic physical survival has seamlessly transformed into a desperate battle for basic mental sanity. The real question is, how does a place like this shape the people who call it home? If you are still here with us, then you are already part of the few who want more than the surface. You have looked past the polished K-pop videos and the flawless tourism campaigns. You have seen the crushing demographic collapse, the massive corporate monopolies, and the devastating psychological darkness hiding underneath. It is incredibly easy to look at the South Korean model from the comfort of the United States and view it as a strange, isolated cultural anomaly. We dismiss the extreme academic pressure and the terrifying corporate loyalty as uniquely Asian phenomena. We comfortably assure ourselves that this specific brand of hyper-capitalistic suffering could never actually take root in the West. But this comforting assumption is a dangerous illusion. South Korea is not an isolated experiment failing in a vacuum. It is a highly compressed, rapidly accelerated preview of a global economic future. The extreme pressures breaking the youth today are the exact same pressures slowly building inside our own borders. Let us go back to Michael in San Francisco. Remember Michael from the very beginning of this journey? He works 60 hours a week in Silicon Valley, pays half his salary in rent, and cannot imagine affording a home or a child. At first glance, his situation seems vastly different from Min Soo sitting in that tiny windowless study room in Seoul. Michael does not have to bow to his manager or take a terrifying national exam just to get an interview. But look closely at the fundamental architecture of their lives. Michael is also living in a system where his intense labor no longer guarantees basic middle-class stability. He is also watching a tiny handful of massive tech corporations swallow up the vast majority of the wealth and opportunity in his country. The specific cultural flavor is different, but the core economic mechanism is exactly the same. The cost of living is rapidly outpacing the value of human labor. We are slowly importing the South Korean reality into the American system, piece by piece. We see it in the explosion of the gig economy, where millions of American workers are stripped of basic benefits and forced to hustle 24 hours a day just to survive. We see it in the crushing weight of student loan debt, essentially mimicking the financial burden of the Korean prestige economy. We see it in our own declining birth rates, as young Americans quietly calculate the impossible cost of raising a family in a rigged economic game. The invisible wall separating the ultra-wealthy elite from the struggling working class is growing taller and thicker every single year. America is currently walking down the exact same dangerous path. We are just walking a few decades behind. South Korea is simply the first nation to fully arrive at the logical, terrifying conclusion of unchecked hypercapitalism. They are serving as a global canary in the coal mine. They are proving with devastating clarity that endless economic growth cannot be sustained by endlessly sacrificing the human soul. When you build a society entirely around corporate efficiency and wealth accumulation, while completely ignoring human well-being, the society eventually consumes itself. The empty kindergartens and the tragic suicide statistics are not just South Korean problems. They are a massive, flashing warning sign projected onto the sky for the entire developed world to see. If we continue to concentrate wealth into the hands of a tiny elite while pushing the middle class to the point of absolute exhaustion, we will inevitably reach the exact same breaking point. The American dream is not immune to the harsh laws of economic reality. If we do not actively change course, the South Korean present will very quickly become the American future. This is the ultimate lesson of the unseen. Look at the skyline one last time. It represents the absolute pinnacle of modern human ambition. We have spent this journey carefully peeling back the shining layers of this architectural achievement. We stripped away the catchy global pop music and the glossy tourism advertisements. We looked past the flawless internet speeds and the autonomous robots. What remains underneath is not a glittering utopia. It is a profound human tragedy playing out in absolute silence. The concrete towers will stand for centuries, but the society that built them is actively choosing to disappear. It is the terrifying paradox of the 21st century. A nation that mastered the physical world has entirely lost the human soul required to inhabit it. The streets are clean, but the youth are fundamentally broken. The trains run with flawless mathematical precision, but they carry an army of exhausted ghosts. This is the heavy price of perfection. This is the true cost of an economic miracle that forgot to measure basic human happiness. But you cannot force us to bring another human being into this beautiful, glittering hell. The thousands of empty kindergartens are a deliberate, heartbreaking choice to spare the unborn. Do not look away from this tragedy with a false sense of geographical comfort. The vast ocean is not a protective barrier against the creeping global disease of hypercapitalism. We like to imagine that the West is fundamentally different, but the underlying economic tectonic plates are shifting in the exact same dangerous direction everywhere. The massive concentration of corporate wealth, the rapid evaporation of the middle class, the impossible cost of housing, the deep psychological burnout of the educated youth. These are the universal side effects of a global economic system that values capital growth over human survival. South Korea simply ran the race faster than anyone else. They reached the terrifying finish line before we did. They are standing at the absolute edge of the demographic cliff, looking back at the rest of the developed world as a giant warning beacon. We must learn to measure the true success of a nation by the basic joy of the people walking in its shadows. The unseen South Korea is a haunting masterpiece of modern societal design. It is a nation of brilliant minds trapped in an unforgiving cage of their own brilliant construction. To truly understand it is to understand the darkest extreme of our own modern ambitions. It is a dark mirror held up to the face of global capitalism. This is South Korea, the unseen pain, the unseen exhaustion, the unseen vanishing of an ancient culture. The journey through these shadows completely changes how you view the world, but this is just one hidden reality in a world full of careful illusions. Tell us which country's hidden reality should we explore next? Japan, the US, or somewhere even more unexpected?